If you want to make epic terrain, this video is for you. Over the years I've tried many different methods to make modeling compound for terrain, but this is by far one of the easiest methods that anyone can make. And it's so cheap, it's almost free. So let's get started. After you pay the fee of liking the video. Modeling compound for terrain needs to tick a few boxes. It has to be lightweight but rigid. It must have good adhesion to the surface you are applying it on. It must dry without shrinkage. It should be easy to use without drying too quickly or too slowly. It shouldn't be toxic, and most importantly, in this video, I'll show you how to make it using materials that everyone can get their hands on. Firstly, you'll need some egg cartons. You can also use any cup trays from McDonald's for example, but I prioritize protein, so I only have a bunch of egg cartons, which I will use today. And you will also need a blender. And no, this does not damage the blender in any way. The trick is to add enough water. Start by filling the blender about halfway with water. And then simply rip an egg carton into small bits and throw it in the blender. The smaller you make the bits, the easier it will be for the blender to shred it up into a fine paper pulp. I did about a third of an egg carton, which will be a nice amount for a medium-sized diorama. You only need to run the blender for a few seconds for it to be a nice paper pulp. If you don't want to stress the blender too much, you can also let it sit in the water for a few minutes before starting the blender. Now it's basically ready to use. However, the temperature will affect how long you can work it before it starts to set, once we add the plaster. So I recommend placing it in the fridge for about an hour. The ideal temperature is about 10 degrees Celsius, which will give us about 15 minutes working time before it starts to set. And while waiting for it to cool down, I rinse out the blender. You can totally do this with the kitchen blender. It doesn't stress the blender at all, as long as you add enough water. The viscosity won't change much after adding plaster, so you can get the paper pulp to the viscosity that you want without having to rush like you would have when the plaster was already added. It was a bit too watery for me, so I used a flour sieve to get rid of some of the extra water. It's important to have everything ready before adding plaster, because as soon as you add it, you have about 10 to 15 minutes to apply it. And if you used room temperature water, you would have less than 5 minutes. For this video, I'll demonstrate applying it on a small base I made using expanded polystyrene. And I will incorporate a few of my DIY rock castings. I add some PVA glue to help it stick to the surface I'm applying it on. I don't use specific ratios, I just go on what I feel should be right. I was aiming for roughly 30% plaster of Paris, 65% paper pulp and 5% PVA glue. If you add more plaster, for example a 50-50 mix, it will be stronger and heavier. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's better. After mixing, it should be around this viscosity. If you want to maybe add a river or anything where you would have to remove some of the terrain in the future, it will be much easier to do when you use a weaker ratio like I used here. And it will be lighter while still being strong enough in my opinion. Using this modeling compound is super easy and satisfying. For incorporating the plaster rocks, it's important to spray them with water before pressing them in place. The dry plaster rocks will absorb a lot of moisture, and if you don't pre-wet them, they won't stick in place. I then simply use an ice cream stick to work it around the rocks and make it look nice. I made a bit too much modeling compound, so instead of letting it go to waste, I grabbed some of my DIY rock molds and put it in there. Many people say that you shouldn't do this, but I can't see why not. I'm gonna make a separate video comparing the modeling compound versus just plaster of Paris for the rocks. Anyway, as it continues to set, I continue to shape and smooth it as desired. After about 20 minutes, I put it on an angle to help the extra water escape. 2 days later it was mostly dried and I cut the overhanging rocks. These are the rocks I made using the modeling compound. They are super light, but I will make a separate video about it. Here's a bit of ASMR so you can get a better understanding of how it feels and the texture. Depending on the weather, it can take a few days to a few weeks to fully dry. It will set and harden within about 30 minutes, but for the water to fully evaporate, it can take up to a week or two, depending on your weather. If you want to make awesome rock molds like these, click the video on screen, and thanks for watching.